warriors. In centuries past, when battle was frequent, warriors were often forced to take a more pragmatic approach to self-sacrifice.
One of the documents I looked at in the 14th century, they said, we attacked the enemy but started suffering casualties, so we fled. No stigma, no dying. They're not going to just, die like that. Later on, there's this notion that you should die for your Lord. The attitudes toward that are very different.
Peacetime luxury or not, most samurai during the Tokugawa shogunal period took the ideas espoused in the warrior code very seriously. In 1703, these principles were the root of one of the most famous displays of warrior loyalty and self-sacrifice in all of samurai history. Asano Naganori was the daimyo of Ako, a fiefdom 100 miles southwest of Osaka. Naganori had been assigned to ceremonial duty in the shogun's palace, a duty that required special training in etiquette. During the course of this training, the etiquette instructor, an established member of the shogun's staff, insulted Naganori. This infuriated the daimyo, and in a fit of rage, he pulled his short sword and slashed at the instructor's head.
He didn't manage to kill him, he managed to wound him, but drawing a weapon and attacking another samurai within the shogun's castle is a capital offense, and so he was immediately arrested and sentenced to commit seppuku.
Naganori carried out the punishment immediately, committing the ritual suicide. Following Naganori's death, the government confiscated his lands. The warriors who had served him instantly became ronin, the term used to describe a samurai without a master. The men no longer had a home or an income.
In the medieval period, this was never really a problem because there's constant warfare, lots of armies that are willing to employ unemployed fighting men. During the Tokugawa period, when there's no warfare and there are no wars and armies are circumscribed and defined by centralized authority, there's less outlet for people who lose their jobs, and so it becomes a bigger sort of problem.
One of Naganori's former samurai, Oishi Kuranosuke, called his comrades together and asked if they would help him take revenge. 46 of them agreed.
Rather than immediately attacking the man who they identified as responsible for their master's downfall, the guy that he'd attacked, figuring that he would be expecting it and be prepared to defend himself up front, they basically laid low for 3 years and pretended to go along with shogunal orders and accept their fate.
The 47 ronin dispersed, and for the next 3 years found other occupations as craftsmen and laborers. Oishi himself pretended to become a drunk and a vagrant, consorting with prostitutes and undesirables. Eventually, just as the ronin had hoped, their target relaxed his guard, thinking he was out of danger. Then the ronin finally made their move.
They met according to prearranged plan, assembled themselves and staged a night attack on the guy's house, found him cowering in a closet, dragged him out, killed him, decapitated him, and then delivered the head to the grave of their master, and then presented themselves to the authorities to be arrested for participating in an illegal vendetta.
All 47 masterless samurai were ordered to commit seppuku, which they did. The episode stunned quiet peacetime Japan, but at the same time it filled many citizens with pride to know that the noble samurai principles of devout loyalty and self-sacrifice had not been extinguished. Today in Ako, Japan, the former home of the daimyo Asano Naganori, a shrine stands in honor of the loyal and selfless 47 ronin. The warrior code by which they lived and that drove their bold action would continue to shape the Japanese national identity and inspire acts of eager self-sacrifice for centuries to come. On July 8, 1853, 4 U.S. warships, commanded by Commodore Matthew C. Perry, sailed into the mouth of Edo Bay. They had come to pry open Japan's borders, whether the Japanese government liked it or not. The U.S. was interested in trade, of course, but their most pressing interest in Japan was as a port for U.S. whaling ships in the far Pacific to resupply and make repairs. Whaling was big business in 1853, since whale oil was the chief source of fuel for household lanterns. In the past, other U.S. dignitaries arriving in Japan in lone vessels had tried forcing their way into the country, but they had been sent packing.
When Perry came in, he was more effective than the earlier people because he had a formidable fleet. And he stationed it right off of Edo, which is the largest city, and disrupted the supply of foods to the capital.
The Japanese were strong coastal sailors, but they had no powerful navy to go toe-to-toe with Perry's heavily armed ships. Plus, the Americans were light years ahead of the Japanese in firearms technology. The U.S. had rifled cannons and musketry that could penetrate samurai armor and crumble the strongest daimyo castle. The only real gun technology the samurai had was that of the rudimentary matchlock musket brought to the islands from Portugal 310 years earlier. 2.5 centuries of peace had eliminated the need for improved firearms. Perry couldn't simply be brushed off, so the Tokugawa government agreed to let him in.
What they did, though, they opened up a consulate in an incredibly remote port. It was still very isolated, so it still took a number of years for things to change. So the Tokugawa really tried to limit his actions.
Over time, the U.S. succeeded in pressuring the shogun into signing treaties that allowed more access.
The first treaty was not a treaty for commercial purposes. It was just a treaty of goodwill, so to speak. The second treaty, which came a few years later, was for trade, where the barbarians could come into Japan, set up trading posts, and actually have free reign of certain areas in Japan. And the samurai didn't like that.
Japan's leaders hadn't given up the fight. They were simply biding their time. They began studying Western military tactics and acquiring modern weaponry as fast as they could. They planned to give the foreigners the boot as soon as possible. But by the mid-1860s, many daimyo and their samurai had grown impatient. They began clamoring for a change in leadership.
Basically, they were afraid that Japan was going to be another China. Remember, Great Britain had subjugated parts of China, Hong Kong, and India. And France and Russia and Great Britain were kind of like waiting on the sidelines like wolves with their fangs dripping. So some of the samurai perceived it.
In the view of many young radical warriors, if the shogun wouldn't act to protect Japan, the only answer seemed to be to overthrow the shogunal government, which had gradually weakened, and restore the emperor to a position of supreme political power. In 1866, it happened, and with surprisingly little bloodshed. That year, the aging shogun Tokugawa Iemochi died, and a new family member, Tokugawa Keiiki, took charge. But Kieiki's reign was over before it started. Aware that much of the warrior class did not support him, he accepted his political fate. In November 1867, fearing an all-out civil war, Shogun Tokugawa Keiiki relinquished power to the young emperor Meiji. Nearly 700 years of warrior government in Japan had come to an inglorious close. But far from improving the lot of the frustrated samurai class, this historic power shift compounded their problems. The emperor's bureaucrats introduced reforms that stripped power from regional daimyo and their samurai and centralized that power in the capital,